Hello. It's getting very cold in the UK now, so I hope you'll excuse me wearing a dressing gown outside as a means of keeping warm. Today I'm going to be talking about a subject that people have been asking for quite a long time, and I don't really know why I haven't done it yet, but it's Celtic influence on English, and this is a very interesting subject because it's sort of debated. Certain features of standard English or English in general are thought by some to be possible Celtic substrate features and thought by others to probably not be Celtic substrate features. So to explain what I mean by a substrate feature, when you have a group of people or a population of people who speak one language and then all of a sudden they adopt another language for some reason, you may have a situation where the first generation of those people to adopt the new language only speaks it as a second language because they learn it in their adulthood, and then when they speak it, features of their first language may leak over into the new language that they've adopted. So an example might be, say, a Spanish person was learning English, they might say, I have 25 years instead of I am 25 years old, which is a grammatical construction that's lifted straight from Spanish. So in that way, their first language might leak over into their second language. And then if that person, or if that population of people starts having children, then the children will acquire this newly adopted language as their first language because it will be spoken all around them as they're growing up. But they will acquire, for want of a better word, an imperfect version of it. They'll acquire a version of the language that already has substrate features from the first language that the people in the population used to have. So they end up as native speakers of a version of the second language which has a load of features leaked over from the first language. So the question is then, to go over the history in basic terms, around the 400s AD, 500s AD, after Roman control had been withdrawn from Britain, which is a very messy subject in its own right, most of the people that lived in Britain presumably spoke Brittonic or some other Celtic language. The Celtic languages are Indo-European languages, so they are related to Germanic languages like English, but only very distantly. And by the time of the migration period, the very early medieval period, English and, for example, Common Standard Brittonic certainly were not remotely mutually intelligible with each other. I'd be very surprised if anyone at the time had any intuition that they were related at all. They were completely different languages, in the same way that English and Polish are different languages nowadays. So this array of dialects of a Celtic language was spoken across England and Britain in general. And then gradually people who spoke Germanic languages from northwestern continental Europe started to come over, probably more peacefully than historical, than archaeologists used to think, but with some degree of violence maybe in some cases. They started to come over and then somehow these Celtic languages got pushed to the margins of the country, and the dominant language in the country became a West Germanic language, which became English. So is this a case of the West Germanic migrants to the country were the elite, and then the people who had previously spoken Celtic languages started to speak the Germanic language because it was a prestige language, and so in learning it features of their original Celtic languages seeped over into their speaking of the Germanic language, eventually causing substrate features which still exist in modern English? Or alternatively, was it at the other end of the spectrum, was it just a population replacement where most of the actual families who spoke Celtic languages were just displaced by families who spoke Germanic languages, so that the Germanic languages had minimal influence from the Celtic languages because there's just a continuous stream of first language speakers? whether there was a full-on population there's a robin over there, whether there was a full-on population replacement in the migration period has long been a subject of debate. One of the recent papers that I know that covered the topic involved my former lecturer Duncan Sayer, Professor Duncan Sayer, who's been on this channel before. And I don't want to misrepresent anything, so if anyone feels that I misrepresented the paper, do let me know. But the impression I got from that paper was that it seems as though genetically there was a large influx of northwestern continental European genetics or genetic material to Britain in the early medieval period, suggesting that there may well have been a partial population replacement where it was actually just West Germanic speakers replacing Celtic language speakers, rather than Celtic language speakers learning the West Germanic language en masse. This lines up with the idea that there don't seem to be many obvious Celtic substrate features in modern English. So, to go through some of the potential candidates for those substrate features, I'll start off with things which are hypothesized to have penetrated standard English, and then maybe I'll talk about cases where there's more obvious influence, like for example in Wales, where there are still, people who speak Celtic languages today. So one feature of Old English that may be a Celtic substrate feature is the presence of two forms of the copula, the word meaning to be. So in modern English this has one basic form which conjugates differently depending on the pronoun: I am, you are, he is. Old English had two underlying forms, each of which conjugated depending on the pronoun, which were beon and weson. And in the present tense, these were two separate words that had different conjugational forms. The word weson had ich eum, thu art, he is, we sind, whereas the word beon had ich beo, thu bist, he bith, and we beoth. If you're familiar with German, or obviously modern English, you might notice that the modern German and modern English copulas both have kind of mixed and matched forms from both of these conjugational paradigms. In English, at least when thou was still a widespread pronoun, you said thou art. In German you say du bist. There was a meaning difference between beon and weson. Beon was used for more gnomic truths, things which were intrinsically and permanently true, like I am human. And weson was used for things that were more temporary, like I am in my house. These two words were only distinguished in present tense. They had the same past tense forms as each other, or if you analyse it slightly differently, weson had past tense forms and beon didn't. Celtic languages like Scots Gaelic also have two forms corresponding to the modern English copula. Someone can correct me if I'm missing any nuance, but in the case of Scots Gaelic, one form, which I guess is maybe pronounced something like be, seems to be more for describing qualities that something has, like I am cold, or I am in the house. And the other form, is, seems to be for describing its identity, I am Simon, it is a chair. Now, that's from the other half of the Celtic family tree to the one that was spoken across most of England just before the early medieval period. The Celtic dialects that are most likely to have come into contact with early English a lot are the Brittonic ones, the ones related to modern Welsh and Cornish. Modern Welsh, according to Stefan Zimmer in 1999, modern Welsh is notable for not having two copular forms, and he makes a comment that suggests the same was true or almost true of Old Welsh. Old Welsh is a fair bit later than Common Brittonic, but Common Brittonic is extremely poorly attested. We don't know much about it at all, so maybe someone else could elucidate whether we know if it had two copulars or not. What we do think with some confidence is that both the Old English forms go back to Proto-Germanic as separate words. Proto-Germanic was a stage in the history of English long before it was spoken in Britain or interacted with Brittonic, so if this is the same distinction that was made in Proto-Germanic, that's maybe evidence that it didn't appear as a result of Celtic influence, although perhaps the presence of a Celtic language with a similar distinction may have reinforced it not disappearing in Old English. A lot of the main papers on this are locked behind paywalls I can no longer get through, so I can't assess this fully, but that is one of the things people have suggested. Another commonly cited thing that might be from Celtic languages is do support. This is using the verb do as an auxiliary in certain grammatical constructions. Where in German you'd ask, like you apples, in modern English you'd have to say, do you like apples? Although this sounds natural to an English speaker, it's typologically a little bit strange. To hear how weird it might sound if you're not used to it, consider where so-called periphrastic do is used by speakers of traditional West Country dialects. I do go to the shop every week. I do get in the tractor and go down the field. Standard English may use this kind of periphrastic do for emphasis. You should go to the shop every week. I do go to the shop every week. In these traditional dialects, though, it's just used in ordinary sentences. I do go to the shop every week to get my food. There are suggestions that this kind of construction, and do support in general, might have come from or been reinforced by Celtic languages. One argument against this is that it only seems to have become normal in prestige English in the very late Middle English or early modern English period, long after Celtic languages had been pushed to something like their current state of marginalisation, apart from perhaps in Ireland. If this was a result of a Celtic substrate, we'd expect that to show up pretty much from the very start of written Old English. Other West Germanic languages do allow a certain amount of do support, although it's not the normal way of expressing things in most of them. It's been suggested that maybe do support was widespread in spoken Old English, but didn't show up in texts because there was some kind of diglossia, the elite speaking and writing in a prestige version of Old English that was maybe more conservative and less Celticised than normal spoken Old English, which we as modern people don't have direct access to. The idea is that we only have access to this prestige dialect because that's what people were writing in. In principle, this kind of diglossia is possible. Many or even most people in their 20s now use terms that are derived from African American English or Jamaican patois, but these tend not to be used in academic journal articles. So the way that language is used in everyday speech between many speakers is not necessarily the same as how language is used in a specific kind of writing. But I'd suggest that in the case of Old English, given that Old English texts are very permissive of dialectal variation, different words and spellings are used in different parts of the country because writers are speaking in different dialects, it seems unlikely that these Brittonicisms would be completely kept out of written Old English and even Middle English for centuries. I think that do support is more likely to have just been an internal development in English that didn't have much to do with Celtic influence. Those aren't the only things that have been attributed to Celtic language influence, but I think they're the most major and robust things I can think of. So what about regional dialects that may have had more Celtic influence than Standard English? First of all, to fulfil my annoying habit of dispelling things, the Cumbric language once spoken in the northwest of England is a very different thing from the Cumbrian dialect more recently spoken. And in my history of going to Cumbria every few weeks to see every few months rather, to see my family, and researching the dialect, I haven't found anything to suggest that the more recent Cumbrian dialect is any more Celtic influence than Standard English is. It only shares a similar name to Cumbric because it's spoken in the same place as Cumbric once was. Cumbrian is a thoroughly West Germanic dialect, just like English and Scots, not to be confused with Scots Gaelic, which is a Celtic language. But there is one exception that's worth momentarily dwelling on. One of the well-known things about Cumbrian, which it shares with some other dialects, is the use of a clearly Celtic-rooted counting system. This is regarded as a sheep counting system, yan, tian, tethera, methera, and so forth, and rather than being direct loans from a Celtic language, the numbers have been altered and rearranged so that they rhyme with each other. The only thing is, even in fairly comprehensive descriptions of Cumbrian from the early 1900s and the 1800s, I haven't been able to find any references to this system at all. When counting occurs in poems or stories, it's usually not sheep they're counting, and so they just use the expected reflexes of Old English numbers in Cumbrian. The one number that carried across to this other system is yan, but this is how you'd expect Old English arn to sound like in Cumbrian anyway. Starn becomes stian, barn becomes bian, and so on. So that's just straightforwardly cognate with the Standard English word one. There's nothing Celtic about that. So maybe this Celtic counting system leaked over from another county and didn't actually exist in Cumbria before 1900-ish. Or maybe it was always present in Cumbrian and just escaped the notice of dialectologists. Welsh, Irish and Northern Scottish English are obvious candidates for extra Celtic influence because they're adjacent to places where Celtic languages are still spoken, and of course the majority of modern Welsh, Irish and Scots Gaelic speakers also speak English because of its dominance in those areas. There are at least Welsh speakers who learnt English as a second language and who are more comfortable using Welsh. I don't personally know if this is true of the other Celtic languages, so if you know, by all means comment. I've long wondered to what extent the pronunciation of these forms of English is Celtic influenced. Is a Welsh accent just a regional accent of English that happens to be spoken in Wales, or is it the accent that a first language Welsh speaker would have if they learnt English from scratch? This question would take an entire systematic study of these languages to address, of these dialects to address. One thing I will say is that the distinctive intonation pattern of Welsh English is similar to the intonation pattern of Welsh, at least on a surface level impressionistic way. Certain consonants are phonetically geminated, held for longer, and things like that.
Ond mae'r daith yn cychwyn nôl yn 1942 yna pryd ces I ngeni, yn Llangefni Sir Fôn, Ynys Fechan ydy Sir Fôn, oddi ar arfordir Gogledd Cymru.
Welsh English also preserves the alveolar tap and trill realisations of r, which were once probably common in general in English. While this is preserved in some other English dialects, its survival in Welsh English may have been partly reinforced by the fact that these sounds exist in the Welsh language. Irish English is another case of regional English accents having Celtic features perhaps leak over into them. Some things are just conservative English features, like a preserved distinction between the vowels in for and fairn, which existed in London English until the 1700s. On the other hand, some features are probably Celtic innovations in Irish English. Modern Irish, correct me if I'm wrong, doesn't have a th sound, and correspondingly many but not all dialects of Irish English also don't have a th sound, replacing it with an aspirated dental t sound, tick, tin. As th is a fairly rare sound cross-linguistically, and it's kind of unstable even in the languages it does exist in, maybe this is a sound that second language English speakers found difficult to pronounce in the early days of colonisation. Again, if somebody has more context to add that might change the interpretation, I'm open to being corrected. Plenty of grammatical features and sentence constructions clearly leak over from Celtic languages into adjacent dialects of English. Irish English traditionally has a habitual aspect, a grammatical feature that allows you to express when somebody does something by habit. As I understand it, I'm going to England implies that you're going there now, whereas I be going to England implies that you go there a lot. Standard English speakers without this feature tend to just assume that those sentences mean the same thing. This is also found in African American English. It's unclear whether the feature has jumped over from Irish English, maybe from contact while slavery was still practiced in North America, or whether it just developed independently in African American English. But if it was the former, it could be an example of Celtic influence going further from the British Isles. Anecdotally, in Welsh English, I've heard people take the use of certain question tags to be a result of Celtic influence, using isn't it as a question tag regardless of what the verb in the sentence is. He went to the shop, isn't it? Or they're back today, isn't it? I had thought that Welsh tends to do the same thing with question tags as Standard English does, having them agree with the verb in the sentence. He went to the shop, didn't he? But by all means correct me if I'm wrong. But this use of question tags in general might be a result of Celtic influence on Standard English even. Celtic languages do this, and other West Germanic languages in my experience tend not to. Germans tend to say the equivalent of he's going to the shop, or. Of course, this or question tag doesn't distinguish between verbs in the sentence. I haven't comprehensively covered the topic, but hopefully this addressed a few things you'd wondered about. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.